The wreck field of Kess Hollow had been drifting undisturbed for 140 years, a slow, silent cemetery of broken hulls tumbling in loose orbit around a dead star. And for most of that century and a half, nobody had come looking for what it held. That was, Foreman Kessa Dre liked to say, exactly the kind of neglect a good scavenger learned to love. Old battlefields meant old tech, forgotten salvage rights, and no one left alive who cared enough to stop you from taking whatever you could carry. She had been running salvage crews through dead systems for 11 years, and in that time she had developed a reliable instinct for which wrecks were worth the fuel to reach, and which ones were picked clean husks not worth the trouble. The ship her long-range scanners flagged as she brought the Harrow's Fortune into low orbit around the debris field did not look, at first glance, like much of anything at all. A long, dark hull, pitted with what her sensors read as a century or more of micrometeorite scarring, running no active power signature, no thermal bloom, nothing to suggest it was anything other than exactly what the rest of the field was. Dead. "Terran hull," said her scanning officer, a lean, quiet man named Ordo Vashti who had flown with her for 6 of those 11 years, and had never once in all that time been wrong about a wreck's classification. Old design, too. Pre-standardization by the look of the hull geometry. This thing's been sitting here since before half the crews working this field were born. "Terran," Kessa repeated, and something in her chest loosened with the particular satisfaction of a scavenger who had just found exactly the kind of prize she'd hoped for. Human wrecks had a reputation on the salvage circuit, overbuilt, over-armored, stuffed with redundant systems that human engineers had never quite learned to streamline the way the galaxy's more established shipbuilders had. Ugly ships by most standards, valuable ones if you knew where to cut. "Bring us in closer. I want eyes on that hull before we commit a boarding team." The Harrow's Fortune closed the distance slowly, running its own systems dark to avoid drawing attention from anything else that might be picking over the field. And as the derelict grew larger in the viewport, Kessa found herself studying it with the same faint, condescending curiosity she reserved for every human wreck she'd ever cracked open. It was an old design, unmistakably, long and blunt where modern warships ran sleek, armored in thick plating that had clearly been chosen for durability over elegance. Its hull marked here and there with the corroded remains of insignia too weathered to read clearly at this range. It looked more than anything like a museum piece that had wandered out of its display case and died quietly in the dark. A relic from whatever war humanity had fought out here that history had long since stopped bothering to remember the details of. "Ugly thing," said Ves Akar, her boarding team lead, a broad-shouldered man with a scar across one cheek that he'd earned on a salvage run gone wrong 3 years earlier and had never let anyone forget. "Humans built these. No wonder they lost whatever fight left this whole field full of wreckage." "Don't get comfortable," Kessa said, though she was smiling as she said it. "Ugly doesn't mean empty. Get your team suited and cut us a way in. I want a full inventory of anything worth hauling before we decide what to strip and what to leave." She did not know, as she gave that order, that the ship drifting silent and dark in front of her had been designed, from its very first blueprint, to look exactly the way it looked, old, dead, unworthy of a second glance, and that the entire purpose of that careful, deliberate illusion was to make sure that scavengers exactly like her would find it, mock it, and walk straight into the one mistake the ship's long, patient watch had been built to answer. The boarding team cut through the outer hull at a maintenance access point Ves Akar's scanners identified as the path of least structural resistance, and the six of them moved into the ship's dark interior with the practiced ease of people who had done this exact thing 100 times before on 100 other wrecks. Their suit lights swept across corridors coated in a fine layer of dust that had settled, undisturbed, for longer than most of them had been alive. Bulkheads scarred with the particular wear pattern of a ship that had seen real combat, deck plating worn smooth in places by the passage of boots that had walked these halls long before any of them were born. "Feels like a tomb in here," said one of the junior crew. A woman named Pris Ambrel, who had only been running with Kessa's team for 8 months and still hadn't fully shaken the instinct to whisper inside dead ships, as though something might still be listening. "That's because it is one," Vess said, running a gloved hand along a stretch of corridor wall where the paint had long since flaked away to bare metal beneath. "Look at this construction. No grace to it at all, just thick plate bolted over thicker plate. Redundant systems stacked on redundant systems, like whoever built this thing assumed it was going to get hit constantly and just wanted to make sure something kept working no matter how much of it got blown off. It's not elegant. It's not clever. It's just stubborn." He knocked a knuckle against the wall, and the dull, heavy sound it made seemed to satisfy some private judgment he'd already formed. Typical human work, overbuilt because they never had the imagination to build it right the first time. They found the ship's main corridor easily enough, and followed it deeper, cataloging as they went. A weapons locker, stripped generations ago by whatever salvage crew had passed through before them and taken the obvious prizes. A cargo hold, mostly empty, holding only the crumbling remains of supply crates too degraded to be worth the cargo space. A medical bay, its equipment outdated by centuries of galactic standard, laughably primitive by the measure of anything currently in service anywhere in Coalition space. Twice moving through the lower decks, Pris Ambrel stopped and looked back the way they'd come, certain she'd heard something, not a groan of settling metal, the ordinary creak any old hull made as it drifted, but something closer to a footstep, soft and deliberate, always just behind the edge of where her suit lights reached. Both times, when she swept her light back along the corridor, there was nothing there but dust undisturbed except by their own passage, and both times she said nothing to the rest of the team, telling herself it was nerves, that dead ships did this to people, made them hear things that weren't there. She would think back on those 2 moments often in the months that followed, and wonder how much of the corridor's stillness had actually been stillness at all, and how much had simply been something old and patient choosing, for reasons of its own, not to be found yet. "This whole ship's not worth the fuel we burned getting here," Pris said, after the 4th compartment in a row turned up nothing but decay and dust. "Whoever hit this thing already took everything good." "Not everything," Vess said, his suit lights catching on a sealed bulkhead door at the corridor's far end, its surface marked with a design that stood out from the corrosion and neglect surrounding it, clean lines, carefully maintained, a plaque bolted to the metal beside it that had clearly been polished, and recently by someone or something that still cared what it said. "That door's not 200 years old. Somebody's kept that clean." Kessa's voice came through the calm channel, sharp with sudden interest. "Get eyes on that plaque. What does it say?" Vess leaned in, brushing away a thin film of dust that had settled even over the careful maintenance, and read the words etched into the metal aloud, his voice carrying, without his quite meaning it to, the first note of genuine unease any of them had shown since boarding. "Terran's Sentinel Vessel Elegy," he read. "Vigil class, commissioned in perpetuity, do not disturb the watch." Nobody on the comm channel said anything for a long moment. Then Pris Ambrel, in a smaller voice than she'd used all mission, Asked the question none of the rest of them wanted to be the one to say out loud. Commissioned in perpetuity means it's still in service, doesn't it? That's not old wreck language, that's active duty language. It's a dead ship, Vess said, but the certainty had gone out of his voice, and he found himself looking at the sealed door with rather more caution than he'd shown any bulkhead so far. It's been sitting here for 140 years, Pris. Whatever crew commissioned this thing is long gone. That plaque's just tradition, sentiment. Humans are sentimental about their dead ships. Everybody on the salvage circuit knows that. Then why, Pris said, is it the only clean thing on this whole ship? Nobody had an answer for that either, and it was in the silence that followed her question that the lights came on. They came on all at once, corridor by corridor, a slow amber glow rising from fixtures that had shown no sign of power a moment before, chasing the darkness back down the length of the ship in a wave that started at the sealed bulkhead and rolled outward through every compartment the boarding team had already searched. Pris Ambril made a short, sharp sound that wasn't quite a scream, and even Ves Akar, who had cracked open more dead ships than he could easily count and prided himself on being unshakable in every one of them, felt his hand drift, without his quite deciding to move it, toward the sidearm holstered at his hip. Report, Kessa's voice snapped through the comm, all trace of her earlier satisfaction gone. What's happening down there? Late. Power's live, Vess said, forcing his voice into something steadier than he felt. Shipwide looks like lights at minimum, we don't know what else. A new voice answered before Kessa could respond. Not hers. Not anyone on the boarding teams, but a calm, measured tone that carried through the ship's own internal speakers with the particular clarity of a system that had been designed, decades ago, to be heard clearly even over the chaos of active combat. This is the Terran Sentinel Vessel Elegy, the voice said. You are trespassing aboard a commissioned vessel of the Vigil program, currently standing watch over a designated war grave. This is your only warning. Withdraw immediately, and no further action will be taken against you. For a long moment, nobody on the boarding team moved. Then Ves Akar, recovering some of his earlier bravado now that the voice had proven to be nothing more than an automated recording rather than whatever half-formed dread had gripped him in the seconds before, allowed himself a short, disbelieving laugh. It's a security loop, he said, more to reassure himself than to inform anyone else. Some kind of old defense protocol still cycling after all these years. There's no crew here. There's nothing here but a very old, very persistent recording, and we're not leaving this ship empty-handed because a dead system played us a warning message. He turned toward the sealed bulkhead, where the plaque still gleamed, cleaner than anything else on the ship. Cut it open. Whatever's back there, it's worth more than the rest of this wreck combined, or nobody would have bothered rigging a scare tactic to protect it. Ves, Pris said, I don't think that's a recording. It doesn't matter what it is, Kessa cut in, her voice tight with the particular impatience of someone who had already sunk too much time and fuel into this wreck to walk away with nothing. We didn't come out here to get spooked by a 100-year-old alarm system. Cut the door. Whatever the humans wanted to protect badly enough to keep one compartment clean for a century and a half, I want it in our cargo hold within the hour. Ves keyed his cutting torch to life, its blue-white flame biting into the sealed bulkhead's edge. And it was in the exact moment the metal began to glow and buckle beneath it that the door slid open on its own, smooth and silent and entirely unassisted by anything the boarding team had done, and a figure stepped through it into the corridor's amber light. She was human, unmistakably, dressed in a uniform whose cut and insignia none of them recognized, but whose bearing left no room for misreading. The calm, unhurried posture of someone who had been standing this exact watch for far longer than the century and a half the wreck's exterior suggested, and who had clearly been expecting, on some level, that a day like this would eventually come. "I gave you a warning," she said, and her voice was the same voice that had spoken through the ship's speakers a moment before, not a recording after all, but a woman standing directly in front of them, entirely and undeniably alive. "I'd have preferred you took it." For a long, frozen moment, none of the boarding team moved. Ves Akar's cutting torch guttered and died in his hand, forgotten. Pris Ambril had gone very still, her earlier unease curdling into something closer to open fear. It was Ves who recovered first, some old habit of bravado reasserting itself even in the face of a moment his instincts were screaming at him to take seriously. "You're a ghost," he said, though it came out less certain than he intended. "This ship's been dead for 140 years. There's no way one person's been standing watch on it that whole time." "I never said I'd been standing it alone, and I never said the whole 140 years fell to me," the woman said. "My name is Captain Amara Voss, commanding officer of the Elegy, currently serving my third rotation of an assignment that has passed through 11 captains before me and will, I expect, pass through several more before this watch is finally released. The Vigil program keeps its ships crewed the same way it's kept them running since the first hull was commissioned. Skeleton crews cycling through extended stasis, waking only when the ship's own systems judge a wake necessary. You've just given mine a very good reason to judge exactly that." Kessa's voice cut through the boarding team's calm channel, sharp and demanding. "Ves, report. What's your status down there?" Ves didn't answer immediately, his eyes still fixed on the calm, unhurried figure standing in the doorway that had, moments before, sealed off nothing more than what he'd assumed was an empty storage compartment. When he finally spoke, it was to the woman in front of him rather than to his own captain overhead. "What is this ship actually protecting?" he asked. "You said a war grave. What war? What grave?" Something shifted in Amara Voss's expression, not quite softening, but taking on a weight that made even Ves's practiced bravado falter. 163 years ago, this system was the site of the last major engagement of the Ashfall Concordance War, fought between Earth and an alliance of border states that had decided, correctly or not, that a young species establishing itself among the stars represented a threat worth eliminating before it grew any stronger. 11,000 people died in the space of 6 hours, across both sides of that fight, Terran and Concordance alike, because a grave doesn't much care which uniform the dead were wearing when they earned it. The battle itself was not glorious, whatever the old recruitment reels back home like to suggest in the years right after the war ended. It was 6 hours of two exhausted fleets grinding each other down in the dark, neither side willing to break first, both sides long past the point where retreat would have saved anyone still fighting. The Elegy's own predecessor in name, the original vessel that first held this exact station before the Vigil program built purpose-designed Sentinels to replace her, was among the ships that didn't survive the engagement. She went down defending a troop transport carrying wounded from an earlier phase of the fight, and every soul aboard both vessels is part of what this field now holds. When the war ended, Earth made a promise to every family who lost someone in this field, and to every other species whose dead rest here alongside ours, that the site would never be looted, never be stripped for salvage, never be treated as anything less than what it is. We built the Vigil program to keep that promise permanently, not for a decade, not for a generation, but for as long as it takes the galaxy to learn that some things aren't for sale. That's a fine story, Kessa's voice broke in over the open channel, cold and unmoved. But stories don't pay a crew's wages, and one woman standing in a doorway doesn't change the fact that my ship has enough firepower trained on that wreck right now to turn it into scrap without breaking a sweat. Captain Voss, is it? I'll offer you the same courtesy you gave my boarding team. Stand aside, let us finish our inventory. And nobody has to find out the hard way whether that pretty speech is backed up by anything more than sentiment. Imara Voss looked past the boarding team, toward the corridor's far bulkhead, as though she could see straight through the hull to the ship hanging in orbit above them. And when she spoke again, her voice carried the same unhurried calm it had held from the moment she'd stepped through the door. "Foreman Dre," she said, "I'd like you to look very closely at the hull plating on every wreck in this field before you decide how confident you feel about that threat. Ask yourself how many other ships out here look exactly as dead as mine did an hour ago, and how many of them might be listening to this exact conversation right now." Aboard the Harrow's Fortune, Kessa Dre turned toward her own sensor display and felt the first real thread of doubt she'd allowed herself since spotting the wreck field, as her scanning officer began, with visibly growing alarm, to pick out details in the surrounding debris that hadn't registered as significant a moment before. Hull fragments that held their position with a precision no genuine debris field maintained. Wreck silhouettes whose power signatures, when Ordo Vashti finally thought to check for them directly instead of assuming their absence, read not as dead, but as dormant, banked low, patient, and entirely capable of waking. "Foreman," Ordo said, his voice unsteady in a way she had never once heard from him in 6 years of flying together. "I'm reading power reserves in at least a dozen other hulls in this field. Maybe more. They've been sitting there the whole time we were scanning, and I never once flagged them because they were built to look exactly like everything else out here." "Impossible," Kessa said, though the word came out with considerably less conviction than she wanted it to carry. "Nobody maintains a 160-year watch across an entire wreck field. That's not defense, that's obsession." "Foreman," Ordo said again, quieter this time, "I've got a 13th signature now. It just came online while I was talking. I don't think it's obsession. I think it's listening to us." "It's neither," Imara Voss said, her voice carrying up through the open channel from the corridor below with the same unhurried calm she'd held since the moment she stepped through the door. "It's a promise, Foreman Dre, and my people have never been especially good at breaking those, even when keeping them costs more than anyone outside the program would consider reasonable." "How many more of these ships are listening to us right now?" Kessa asked, and for the first time since the encounter began, there was something in her voice closer to genuine unease than professional caution. "All of them," Imara said simply. "That's rather the point of a coordinated watch, Foreman. None of us stands it entirely alone." The silence that followed lasted longer than Kessa would have liked to admit, and when she finally spoke again, it was with the flat, careful tone of someone recalculating an entire situation from the ground up. "You have exactly one choice left that ends with your crew going home. Withdraw your boarding team, return anything you've already removed from this vessel, and leave this field the same way every scavenger before you eventually learned to quietly, and without testing whether the rest of what's sleeping out here is willing to stay that way." For a long moment, the channel held nothing but silence, Kessa weighing a decision that had, somewhere in the last several minutes, stopped being about profit margins and salvage rights, and become instead a question of how badly she was willing to gamble her entire crew's survival against a woman who did not sound, in the slightest, like she was bluffing. It was Ves Akar who broke first, down in the corridor, some old, stubborn instinct refusing to let the moment end without one last attempt to reclaim the authority he'd walked aboard with. He lunged, not for Amara Voss directly, but for the sidearm at his hip, the motion fast and desperate in the way of a man who has already decided on some level that he's lost and is simply refusing to accept it yet. He never cleared the holster. The corridor around him seemed to move before he finished the motion, panels sliding back along the walls he dismissed an hour earlier as crude, overbuilt plating, revealing restraint mechanisms that closed around his wrists and ankles with a speed and precision that spoke of systems designed, deliberately and with great care, to handle exactly this kind of desperate, poorly considered aggression without ever needing to draw a weapon of their own. Pris Ambril didn't move at all, her hands already raised, some instinct for self-preservation overriding whatever loyalty she felt toward a crew that had led her into this in the first place. "The ship's not overbuilt because we lacked imagination," Imara said, watching Vess strain uselessly against restraints that had held far more capable soldiers than a salvage crew's boarding lead. "It's overbuilt because a vessel standing 160-year watch over 11,000 dead needs to survive every kind of provocation someone might eventually be foolish enough to offer it. And the people who built the Vigil program understood better than most that dignity and restraint aren't the same thing as vulnerability." She looked up toward the ceiling, toward the ship hanging above them that had, moments before, believed itself to hold every advantage in this encounter. "Foreman Dre, your boarding team is secure, unharmed, and will remain that way as long as nothing further happens down here. I'd suggest you use whatever time that buys you to reconsider the math on this engagement, because right now the only thing standing between your crew and a very different kind of mourning is my continued willingness to resolve this without anyone else getting hurt." Kessa Dre had built her career on knowing exactly when a gamble had stopped being worth the risk, and she recognized, watching her scanner readouts fill with a dozen newly revealed power signatures scattered across a field she'd assumed, an hour ago, was nothing but harmless wreckage, that this was precisely such a moment. She thought of every scavenger crew she'd ever heard rumors about, over 11 years on the salvage circuit, who had ventured into old battlefields and never come back, their disappearances written off as accidents, misjudged debris fields, unlucky navigation. She wondered, with a chill she didn't care to examine too closely, how many of those disappearances had actually been something else entirely. Pris Ambril, still standing with her hands raised in the corridor below, found herself thinking of the 2 moments during the search when she'd sworn she heard footsteps just behind the reach of her suit lights, and understood with a small, cold certainty that she hadn't imagined them after all. Someone, or something the ship considered close enough to someone, had been watching them the entire time, patient and unhurried, waiting to see how far a crew of strangers would go before the watch decided enough curiosity had tipped over into something that could no longer be politely ignored. It was not a comfortable thought, but it was, she found, oddly less frightening than the alternative would have been. A ship that killed on reflex, rather than one that had simply been giving them every reasonable chance to leave before it needed to prove anything at all. "Stand down," Kessa said, over the open channel, the words costing her more pride than she wanted to admit even to herself. "V. SS Pris, all of you stand down, cooperate, and let's get off this wreck in one piece." She switched channels, addressing Amara Voss directly. "You'll get your boarding team back. Whatever we already pulled off that ship gets returned. We're leaving this field and we're not coming back. That's the deal I'm offering, Captain, and I'd suggest you take it, because it's the best one either of us is walking away from today." "It's the only deal on the table," Imara said, "and I'd already decided to offer it before you did. I don't take pleasure in this, Foreman Dre, whatever your crew's instincts told them to expect from a wreck this size waking up around them. The Vigil program was never built to punish curiosity or even ordinary greed. Most of the crews who drift through this field never even realize what they've stumbled into, because most of them have the sense to leave a clearly marked grave sight alone before it ever comes to this. Your crew crossed a line the moment Vess drew a weapon in a corridor lined with the names of the dead, and I'd have been within every right the program grants me to end this a great deal less gently than I have. I'm choosing not to, because 160 years of standing this watch has taught me that mercy, offered consistently and without exception, does more to protect what we're guarding here than cruelty ever could. The restraints along the corridor wall released Ves Akar without ceremony, and he stumbled back a step, rubbing at wrists that had been held with a precision that left no mark despite the strength behind it, staring at Imara Voss with an expression that had shed every trace of the contempt he'd walked aboard with. "You could have killed me," he said. "Easily, why didn't you?" "Because the 11,000 people resting in this field died in a war that started, in no small part, because two sides decided the fastest answer to a provocation was always the deadliest one available," Imara said. "I've spent 3 rotations of my life guarding what that decision cost, and I'm not interested in adding to the count over a salvage crew's bad judgment, however close you came to earning it. Go home, Mr. Akar. Tell whatever crews you drink with on the salvage circuit exactly what you found out here. And maybe the next boarding team that drifts into a field like this one thinks twice before cutting through a hull that looks a little too quiet to be entirely dead." The Harrow's fortune left Kess Hollow within the hour, its cargo hold empty of everything it had taken, its crew considerably quieter on the return voyage than they'd been on the way out. Ves Akar told the story exactly once, to a table of fellow salvagers in a station bar 3 jumps from the field, expecting disbelief and finding instead a handful of nodding heads and one older captain who admitted quietly that she'd steered 2 separate crews wide of quiet-looking battlefield wrecks over the years, following nothing more than an old instinct she'd never been able to explain and had never wanted to test. Stories on the salvage circuit traveled the way such stories always did, reshaped a little with each retelling, some details sharpened, others softened, but the core of it spreading faster than any of the individuals who told it could have predicted. Within a season, Kess Hollow had acquired a reputation among the scavenger networks that no amount of easy salvage could outweigh. A graveyard best left alone, not because the dead were dangerous, but because whatever watched over them clearly still was. It was, Imara Voss reflected, exactly the outcome the Vigil program had always hoped for, achieved the same way it had been achieved at every other watch site across the scattering of old battlefields Earth had quietly committed itself to guarding. Not through conquest, not through fear broadcast wide enough to reach every corner of the galaxy at once, but through the slow, patient accumulation of stories, each one making the next scavenger crew's instincts sharper. Each incident making the field a little safer, without a single additional life needing to be lost defending it. The formal report reached Coalition attention rather more quickly, because Kessa Dre, in the days following her crew's return, had made the decision, over the objections of at least 2 of her own people, who argued the whole affair was better left forgotten, to file an official account with the Regional Trade Authority, along with a formal request that Kess Hollow be added to the Coalition's Registry of Protected Sites, a request that arrived against considerable odds. On the desk of a junior records administrator who had never heard of the Vigil program, and initially assumed the filing was some kind of elaborate hoax. Back on Earth, the disclosure landed rather differently than the scavenger crew's misadventure alone might have. Once the wider public understood that the Vigil program was not a single, isolated posting, but a permanent commitment spanning 41 sites and a century and a half of continuous, largely unheralded service. There was pride in it, the particular quiet pride of a species discovering that some of its own had spent generations keeping a promise so thoroughly that most people had never even known there was a promise to keep. There was grief, too, among the families who learned only now that relatives long assumed lost without a trace actually rested somewhere specific, somewhere guarded, somewhere that could, if they wished, finally be visited rather than simply mourned in the abstract. Terran media outlets ran retrospectives on the HFY Concordance War for the first time in decades, interviewing historians who had spent careers studying a conflict most of the public had reduced to a handful of vague, half-remembered facts, and found, almost overnight, an audience considerably more attentive than any of them had grown used to expecting. Admiral in command of the Vigil program's Oversight Office, a soft-spoken administrator named Warwick Enns, who had spent 30 years managing a program built entirely around not being noticed, found himself testifying before the Terran Assembly for the first time in his career, answering questions from representatives who had, until recently, had no idea the program existed at all. 41 sites, he told the Assembly, in testimony that would later be quoted widely across both Terran and Coalition media, guarded continuously since the years immediately following the war's end, by officers who volunteer for a service that offers no medals, no public ceremony, and no guarantee that anyone beyond their own chain of command will ever know their name. I understand the impulse to ask why this was kept so quiet for so long. The honest answer is that a promise like this one works best when it isn't a performance, when it isn't maintained for an audience, but simply kept year after year, because it was made, and because keeping it matters regardless of who's watching. I'd ask this assembly to consider that the same discretion that once felt, to some of you, like an unnecessary secrecy is precisely what let the program do its work as well as it has for as long as it has. It was not a hoax, and the administrator's cautious inquiries eventually surfaced what Terran diplomatic archives had, for over a century, kept quietly on file but never widely publicized. A program, established in the years immediately following the HFY Concordance War, committing Earth to the permanent, uninterrupted defense of every site where the conflict's dead remained, regardless of which side of the war they had fought on. 41 such sites existed across the sector, each guarded by a Vigil-class Sentinel vessel disguised, deliberately and with considerable engineering care, to blend into whatever wreckage or ruin already occupied the site, so that the watch itself would never draw the kind of attention that might turn a quiet grave into a target. It is, by any reasonable measure, one of the more unusual military commitments I've encountered in my tenure on this council, said Councillor Aveline Torsk of the Meridian Compact, reviewing the filing during a routine session that had, by the time the full implications settled in, stopped being routine at all. 160 years of continuous deployment across 41 separate sites, maintained entirely through voluntary rotational stasis service. All of it kept quiet enough that this body had no formal awareness the program existed, until a salvage crew's misadventure forced the matter into the open. Ambassador Inez Calloway, seated in the observer gallery reserved for member species not directly implicated in a session's business, requested, and was granted a brief statement on Earth's behalf, delivered with the same measured care she brought to every difficult diplomatic moment of her long career. This council has spent a great deal of today's session debating whether the Vigil program's secrecy constitutes some manner of violation, she said. I gently suggest the more relevant question is what it says about the character of a species willing to maintain 160 years of unglamorous, uncelebrated service, asking nothing in return beyond the simple, undisturbed rest of its dead. Earth did not build the Vigil program to impress this council, and I'd ask that this body not mistake our long silence about it for anything other than exactly what it was, a promise kept quietly, because quiet was what the promise required. It raises an obvious question, said a colleague from a neighboring seat, a species whose long institutional memory made them, as a rule, harder to surprise than most of the chamber's other members. How many other quiet commitments does this species maintain that this council has simply never had reason to notice? Nobody in the chamber had a ready answer for that, and the silence that carried, for those paying close enough attention, the particular weight of a council recalculating, once again, exactly how much of a young species' character it had spent the last century failing to see clearly. It was, in truth, a fair question, and one that Terran Unified Command answered more fully than the Council had perhaps expected, in a supplementary filing that laid out, for the first time in any public record, the full scope of the Vigil program's reach. 41 sites scattered across a dozen sectors, each one a battlefield or a crash site or a place where some forgotten skirmish had left more dead than any formal history had ever bothered to record in detail, each guarded by its own sentinel vessel and its own small, rotating crew of officers who had volunteered, across generations, for a service that offered no glory, no public recognition, and no guarantee that the watch they stood would ever matter to anyone beyond the families who had long ago stopped expecting an answer to their grief. At a frozen debris field on the far side of Coalition space, a sentinel captain named Oduya Bassi had stood watch for 2 full rotations over the wreckage of a colony fleet lost to a navigational disaster 3 centuries past, never once needing to raise weapons against anything more threatening than the occasional confused survey ship. At a scorched moon in a system so remote most star charts simply listed it by catalog number, a young lieutenant named Pharaoh Idse had spent 11 years of waking rotation, maintaining a watch so quiet she had begun, privately, to wonder whether her posting was closer to punishment than honor, until the day a mining consortium tried to break ground on what its own surveys had failed to flag as a mass grave, and she'd had cause, for the first time in her career, to understand exactly why the posting existed at all. Each of them had trained the same way Imara Voss had trained. Each of them had inherited the same promise, passed down through 11 captains before her at Kess Hollow alone, and an uncounted number more across the program's other 40 sites. None of them had ever expected the quiet, patient nature of their service to become, within the same calendar year, a matter of open galactic record and no small amount of galactic debate. Word of the Vigil program's existence reached, eventually, a small farming community on the outskirts of one of Earth's oldest orbital settlements, where a woman named Del Marchetti had grown up hearing family stories about a great-great-grandfather who died in a war so old that most of the details had blurred into the comfortable vagueness reserved for history that no longer felt urgent. She had always known, in the distant way families know such things, that Corporal Aldo Marchetti had died at a place called Kess Hollow, and that no remains had ever come home, because the fighting there had been too total, too final, for recovery to have been possible in its aftermath. She had assumed, without ever quite examining the assumption, that this meant her ancestor's grave was nowhere at all, a name on a family record, unanchored to any place a person could actually visit. The news that reached her changed that. Kess Hollow was not an unmarked absence. It was a site, real and specific, that had been guarded without interruption for 160 years by officers who rotated through decades of stasis sleep, for the sole purpose of making sure no one ever disturbed what remained there. And it took Del Marchetti the better part of a month to process the strange, unexpected comfort of learning that her great-great-grandfather's grave, however distant and however inaccessible it remained to an ordinary civilian, had never once, in all the years since his death, gone unwatched. She wrote a letter, an old-fashioned gesture in an age of instantaneous communication, but one that felt, to her, like the only appropriate response to a promise that had itself been kept in an old-fashioned way, through patience and stasis, and 160 years of quiet, unglamorous service. She addressed it to the Vigil Program's Oversight Office, without any real expectation that it would reach anyone in particular, and asked only that whoever stood the watch at Kess Hollow know that Corporal Aldo Marchetti's family had never forgotten him, and that learning he had never been left alone in that field meant more to her than she quite had words to explain. The letter reached Imara Voss 9 months later, delivered during a routine resupply run to the Elegy that coincided, by pure administrative accident, with the tail end of her current waking rotation. She read it twice, standing in the same corridor where she had confronted a boarding team nearly a year before, and found herself, for the first time in longer than she could easily measure, feeling the specific weight of the watch she'd sworn not as an abstraction, a duty owed to a program and a promise, but as something considerably more immediate, 11,000 people, and the families who had spent a century and a half wondering whether anyone still remembered them. She had the letter copied into the ship's permanent record, alongside similar messages that had arrived over the decades from other families who had learned, through one channel or another, that the Vigil program existed and that their own lost relatives rested somewhere within its care. It was not a large collection. The program had, after all, spent a century and a half deliberately avoiding the kind of attention that would have made such letters common. But it was, she thought, exactly the kind of quiet accumulation that made the stasis cycles and the isolation and the strange, suspended nature of her service feel like something other than sacrifice for its own sake. It was Del Marchetti herself who requested, some months after her letter reached the Elegy, permission to visit the field where her great-great-grandfather had died, an unusual request, and one the Vigil Program's Oversight Office had never had cause to seriously consider before the events of the past year forced the entire program into a rather more public existence than it had ever intended. Imara approved the visit personally, standing in the Elegy's small observation bay when the transport carrying Del arrived, watching a woman in her middle years step off a shuttle onto a ship that had, until recently, existed for her only as a name on an old family record, and a story too vague to feel entirely real. "I didn't expect it to look like this," Del said, once the formalities of the visit had settled and Imara had walked her through the ship's main corridor, past the same sealed bulkhead door that had, a year before, opened onto a very different kind of encounter. "I suppose I imagined something grander, a monument, something with his name carved into it somewhere I could put my hand against." "There is a memorial," Imara said, and led her deeper into the ship, past compartments the Elegy's crew maintained with the same quiet, unglamorous care they gave to every other system aboard, until they reached a small chamber near the vessel's center that no boarding party, in all its 160 years of standing this watch, had ever been permitted to see. The walls were lined, floor to ceiling, with names, 11,000 of them, etched into panels that had been polished and repolished across generations of rotating crews. Terran names beside concordance names beside the names of the handful of other species who had died in the crossfire of a war that, in the end, had not much cared which side anyone had been fighting for. Del found Corporal Aldo Marchetti's name near the chamber's far wall, and stood in front of it for a long time without speaking, and Imara, who had stood this same silent vigil beside dozens of other visiting families across 3 rotations of her service, said nothing at all, understanding that some moments asked for witness rather than words. "Thank you," Del said finally when she was ready to leave. "Not just for keeping him safe, for letting me finally see that he was." "That's the whole of the promise," Imara said. "It always was." The publicity that followed the Coalition's formal acknowledgement of the Vigil program brought with it a consequence Imara Voss had privately feared from the moment she'd learned her encounter with the Harrow's fortune had become public record. It made Kess Hollow a target for exactly the kind of people the program's century and a half of quiet secrecy had always been designed to avoid. Rumors of ancient, still active Terran warships guarding forgotten battlefields were one thing when they stayed rumors, dismissed by most of the galaxy as scavenger superstition. They became something else entirely once a Coalition Records office confirmed them as fact, and it took less than 4 months for that confirmation to reach the attention of a faction with considerably more firepower than a salvage crew, and considerably less interest in walking away quietly. The Ordnance Vanguard had never formally accepted the terms that ended the Ashfall Concordance War, a splinter remnant of the old Concordance Alliance that had spent a century and a half nursing a grievance the rest of their species had long since set aside, and the news that a Terran Sentinel ship stood watch over a field containing what they still considered rightfully theirs: ancient weapons technology, salvage rights, and in the darker corners of their ideology, a debt of humiliation they believed only violence could settle, reached them not as a curiosity, but as a provocation they had been waiting a very long time for an excuse to answer. They came to Kess Hollow with 4 warships, considerably more capable than anything the Harrow's Fortune's scavenger crew had brought, running weapons hot from the moment they dropped out of slipspace, with no ultimatum, no W. Arning and no interest whatsoever in the careful, patient diplomacy that had resolved the previous incident without a single life lost. Imara Voss was 3 months into her stasis cycle when the Elegy's automated threat assessment woke her, and she came up out of the cold, disorienting fog of extended sleep to a tactical display already lit with weapons fire, the ship's hull ringing under the first exchange of an engagement that had begun before she'd even finished regaining full consciousness. "Report," she said, forcing the word out through a throat still thick with stasis fog, pulling herself upright against a wave of dizziness she had no time to indulge. 4 hostile vessels, Ordnance Vanguard configuration, engaging at close range, the ship's tactical system reported, its voice carrying the same measured calm it always did, regardless of the danger the numbers behind it represented. "Hull integrity at 81% and falling. They are concentrating fire on our primary weapons batteries. I assess their objective as disabling our defenses rather than destroying the vessel outright. They intend to board and strip this site once we're no longer capable of resisting." Imara reached her command chair and dropped into it, tactical readouts snapping into focus around her with the particular, practiced speed of an officer who had drilled for exactly this scenario more times than she could count across 3 separate stasis rotations, even though she had never, until this moment, needed to execute it in earnest. 4 ships. Real warships, not a salvage cruise boarding party. Bringing weapons fire the Elegy's century-and-a-half-old hull had not been tested against in longer than any living memory could account for. "They picked the wrong grave to rob," she said, and there was no fear in her voice, only the flat, focused calm of a woman who had spent 3 lifetimes' worth of waking hours preparing for precisely this test, and had never once doubted in all that preparation that the ship beneath her would answer it. "Bring weapons batteries 3 through 9 online, full power, and signal the field." "Signaling now," the tactical system confirmed, and out across the drifting expanse of Kess Hollow's century-old wreckage, a dozen other hulls that had spent 160 years looking exactly as dead as the Elegy once had began, one by one, to wake. The commander of the Ordnance Vanguard's lead vessel, a grizzled veteran named Castor Rhine, who had built his entire career on the conviction that his people's defeat in the Ashfall Concordance War had been a betrayal rather than a loss fairly earned, watched his tactical display with the first genuine alarm he'd felt since committing his ships to the attack. As a single aging Terran hull that should, by every calculation his intelligence teams had provided, have been minutes from disabled, instead returned fire with a precision and intensity that tore through his lead escort's shields in a single concentrated volley. "That's not possible," he said, staring at damage reports that made no sense against a hull his own scanners had assessed, before the engagement began as carrying weapons systems no more advanced than anything from the war itself. "Their tech should be a century and a half out of date." "It is a century and a half out of date, Commander," came a voice over the open channel, calm and unhurried in a way that unsettled him considerably more than shouting would have. "That's rather the point you and everyone else who's ever mocked this ship's design keeps missing. Old doesn't mean weak, it means tested. Every system on this vessel has been maintained, upgraded within the limits of its original architecture, and drilled against exactly this kind of assault for 160 years by crews who understood, better than most navies currently in service, precisely how much punishment their hull was built to survive." Castor Rhine had no time to formulate a response before his sensor officer reported, in a voice climbing rapidly toward panic, that the wreck field around them had stopped behaving like wreckage entirely. A dozen hulls that his own scanners had catalogued, in the hours before the attack, as inert debris no different from the thousands of other broken ships scattered across Kess Hollow, were powering up in near-perfect coordination, weapons batteries swinging to bear on his fleets, flanks with the same methodical precision the Elegy had already demonstrated against his lead escort. "They're not derelicts," his sensor officer said. "Commander, this whole field is armed. It's been armed the entire time." The battle that followed lasted less than 20 minutes, though it felt, to every officer aboard the 4 Ordnance Vanguard vessels caught in the crossfire, considerably longer than that. 20 minutes in which every assumption they had carried into the engagement about outdated Terran technology and a single aging Sentinel ships. Vulnerability unraveled against the reality of a defense network that had been quietly, patiently perfected across a century and a half of continuous readiness. The Elegy took the brunt of the opening exchange, her hull integrity falling to 62% before the rest of the field's dormant sentinels fully joined the engagement, and for nearly 90 seconds, long enough that Imara felt the weight of every one of her 3 rotations pressing down on her at once. It was not at all clear that the field's other sentinels would wake in time. "Sentinel response delayed," the tactical system reported, its voice as calm as ever, even as a second concentrated volley tore through the Elegy's forward shielding and alarms cascaded across every station on the bridge. Estimated 40 seconds until the nearest dormant hull reaches combat readiness. Hull integrity at 54% and falling. Recommend defensive maneuvering to buy additional time. "Buy it," Imara said, gripping the arms of her command chair as the ship shuddered under another impact, watching a status board that had never, in 3 lifetimes of drilled simulations, actually shown her own ship's survival margin narrow this close to the edge. 40 seconds had never felt so long. She thought, in the strange, suspended clarity that came over her in moments like this, of Corporal Aldo Marchetti and the 10,999 others whose rest she had sworn to protect, and found in that thought something steadier to hold on to than the numbers on her display. Hold her together. We've survived worse than this waiting on help before, and we'll survive it again. The first of the field's other sentinels woke with 11 seconds to spare, its weapons batteries swinging onto the Vanguard's flanking cruiser before the enemy crew had any warning at all that the wreckage around them had stopped being wreckage. And within the space of a single exchange, the momentum of the engagement reversed entirely. By the time Castor Rhine gave the order to withdraw what remained of his fleet, 2 of his 4 ships were disabled beyond any hope of continuing the fight, and the other 2 were retreating under fire they had no remaining capacity to answer. Imara Voss did not pursue. She had learned, across 3 rotations of this exact watch, that a battle won decisively did more to protect the field in the long run than one pressed to its absolute, punishing conclusion, and she gave the order to let the Vanguard's surviving ships withdraw rather than run them down, watching on her tactical display as Castor Rhine's flagship limped out of weapons range with a restraint that cost her nothing, but the satisfaction of a complete and total victory she had, by every measure that mattered. Already secured. "Hull integrity?" she asked, once the last Vanguard signature had cleared the engagement zone. 58% and stable, the tactical system reported. Repairs will require approximately 11 days at current resource levels. No casualties among the active watch crew. "Good," Imara said, allowing herself, for the first time since waking into the middle of an active engagement, a long breath that carried more relief in it than she'd admit to anyone outside this ship. "Log the engagement. Full report to Coalition Oversight and to Terran Unified Command. I suspect this is a conversation the wider galaxy is going to want to have rather sooner than any of us expected." News of the battle at Kess Hollow reached the wider galaxy with considerably more force than the earlier scavenger incident had managed, in no small part because the Ordnance Vanguard's surviving crews, once they limped home, proved far less inclined toward quiet embarrassment than Kessa Dre's salvage team had been. Castor Rhine filed a furious report with what remained of his faction's leadership, insisting that Earth had violated the terms of the war's end by maintaining an active, undeclared military presence disguised as a memorial site, and demanding some form of coalition censure for what he characterized as deception on a scale the Ashfall Concordance's surviving remnant could never forgive. The Coalition Council, faced now with 2 separate incidents in the same calendar year involving the same previously unknown program, convened a formal inquiry considerably more searching than the one that had followed Kessa Dre's filing. And it was in the course of that inquiry that Terran Unified Command finally released the Vigil program's complete operational history. 41 sites, each with its own Sentinel vessel and rotating stasis crew. Each maintained not as a hidden weapons cache, but as precisely what its charter had always described: a permanent, sworn defense of ground where the dead of a terrible war remained, offered to every side of that conflict without discrimination, and defended with lethal force only when someone chose to test that promise directly. I would remind, this council, said Ambassador Inez Calloway, delivering Earth's formal response to Castor Rhine's complaint with the same careful precision she'd brought to every difficult session of her long career, that the Ordnance vanguard did not stumble into an ambush. They brought 4 armed warships to a grave site with the explicit intention of stripping it for salvage and settling a grievance their own species' formal government renounced a century and a half ago. The Vigil program did not fire the first shot in that engagement, and it did not pursue the retreating survivors once the threat was neutralized. I would suggest the appropriate question for this council is not why Earth maintains such rigorous protection over a promised grave site, but why a faction still nursing an unresolved war chose violence as its opening argument against a program whose entire purpose, from its very first charter, was to prevent exactly that kind of desecration. The inquiry closed, eventually, with no censure against Earth, and a formal notice of condemnation against the Ordnance Vanguard faction instead, a outcome that satisfied almost no one entirely, but left, in its wake, a considerably clearer understanding across coalition space of exactly what the scattered, ancient-looking wrecks drifting through a handful of old battlefields actually represented. Castor Rhine did not survive his faction's political fallout in any capacity that resembled the position he'd held before the attack. Stripped of his command by leadership eager to distance itself from an engagement that had accomplished nothing beyond confirming, publicly and decisively, exactly the kind of retaliatory capacity the Vigil program had always quietly possessed. He spent the years that followed in a diminished role, occasionally approached by younger officers curious what had actually happened at Kess Hollow, and he found, to his own quiet surprise, that he no longer had much appetite for embellishing the story in his own favor. "We came expecting salvage," he told one such officer years later, in an account that eventually made its way, second-hand, into the same coalition archives that had once dismissed the Vigil program as scavenger superstition. "We left having learned that some promises get kept whether or not anyone's watching to make sure of it. I fought a great many engagements in my career and lost a few of them honestly. That one I lost because I refused to believe an old ship could still be exactly as dangerous as it looked capable of being, if anyone ever bothered to test it properly. I don't make that mistake anymore, and I'd advise anyone who still nurses my faction's old grievance to learn the same lesson a great deal more cheaply than I did." Salvage crews who had once treated old war sites as easy, unguarded targets grew considerably more cautious in the months that followed, and more than one experienced foreman found themselves, in briefings before a new run, repeating some version of the same warning Ves Akar had carried back from Kess Hollow and told to anyone who'd listen. That a wreck too quiet to be entirely convincing was sometimes exactly that quiet on purpose, and the fastest way to learn the difference the hard way was to keep cutting into hulls that had earned the right to be left alone. Kessa Dre heard about the battle from 3 separate sources before the week was out, and found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, feeling less vindicated by the news than unsettled by how close her own crew had come to a considerably worse ending than the one they'd actually received. She tracked down Ves Akar at a station bar not long after, and found him quieter than she remembered, nursing a drink he hadn't touched in some time. "You heard," he said without looking up. "4 warships," Kessa said, sliding into the seat across from him. "Real ones, not a salvage crew poking around where it shouldn't, and that ship held the line long enough for the rest of the field to wake up and finish the job. I used to tell people that ship was ugly, Vess said. Overbuilt. No imagination in the design, I said, like whoever built it just wanted something that could take a beating because they didn't know how to build something that wouldn't need to. He turned his glass slowly on the table, watching the light catch in it. I stood in that corridor and called her people stubborn for building it that way. Turns out stubborn was exactly the design brief, and it held against 4 warships better than anything currently in service anywhere I've flown. I don't think I'm in a position to mock human engineering anymore, Foreman. Not after that. Kessa didn't have much of an answer for that, and the two of them sat in a silence that carried, for once, something closer to genuine respect than either of them was entirely used to extending toward a species they'd spent most of their careers regarding as an interesting but ultimately unremarkable presence on THE edges of galactic trade. Imara Voss had not always intended to spend her career standing watch over the dead. She had graduated from the Terran Naval Academy with ambitions considerably more conventional than a Vigil-class posting. A career in fleet command, perhaps, or deep space exploration, the kind of visible, celebrated service that had drawn her to the Academy in the first place. It was a chance posting in her 3rd year, a mandatory rotation through the program's training pipeline that every officer candidate completed without much expectation of being selected for it permanently. That changed the direction of her entire career. She remembered, still, the particular weight of standing for the first time in a memorial chamber much like the one aboard the Elegy, reading names she had never heard before and would never meet the families of, and feeling something settle into place inside her that she had not expected and could not entirely explain. A conviction that the quiet, uncelebrated work of keeping a promise mattered every bit as much as the visible, decorated work of winning a battle, and that she would rather spend her career on the former than the latter. Her recruiting officer, a weathered captain nearing the end of her own final rotation, had warned her plainly what the posting would cost. Extended stasis meant years passing outside that she would never fully experience as they happened, relationships strained or lost entirely to the strange, dislocating rhythm of waking every few years into a galaxy that had moved on without her. A career that offered no promotions in the conventional sense, no public recognition, no guarantee that her name would ever appear anywhere beyond the program's own internal service record. Imara had accepted the posting anyway, the same way, she suspected, every officer who ever volunteered for the Vigil program had accepted it, not because the cost seemed small, but because the promise seemed worth more than the cost. 3 rotations in, standing in a corridor she had defended twice now against threats neither of her predecessors at this exact post had ever needed to face, she found she still believed that, as certainly as she had the day she signed her transfer papers. 9 days after the engagement, with the Elegy's hull integrity restored to full operational capacity and the wreck field around Kess Hollow settling back into its long, patient stillness, Imara Voss stood once more in that same corridor and allowed herself a rare moment of simply looking at the ship around her. The scarred plating, the deliberately unremarkable hull design, the century and a half of careful, unglamorous maintenance that had, twice now within the span of a single year, proven capable of far more than anyone outside the Vigil program had ever imagined it needed to be. She thought, standing there, of the 11 captains who had held this exact post before her, none of whom she had ever met, most of whom had lived and served and eventually retired or died without a single incident testing whether the watch they kept was anything more than ceremony. She wondered sometimes whether any of them had privately hoped, across their own long decades of quiet stasis and uneventful rotation, that the watch would simply continue that way forever, necessary in principle, untested in practice. A promise kept purely through the discipline of keeping it rather than through any dramatic proof of its worth. She understood now, in a way she suspected none of her predecessors ever fully had cause to, exactly what it felt like when a promise like that was finally, unmistakably tested, twice over within the span of a single year and held. Ves Akar never returned to salvage work at old battlefield sites, choosing instead to specialize in industrial wreck recovery, a considerably less romantic corner of the trade, but one that let him sleep. He told Kessa once, without wondering whether the next hull he cut into might be listening. Pris Ambril stayed with Kessa's crew a while longer, but she carried what she'd learned at Kess Hollow into every subsequent job, developing over the following years a reputation on the salvage circuit as the one who always insisted on a longer scan before cutting, the one who'd learned, the hard way, that quiet didn't always mean empty, and that the difference was sometimes worth more than any prize a faster crew might claim first. "Prepare the stasis chamber," Imara told the ship's systems, when the last of the post-engagement reports had been filed and the watch had settled back into its long, ordinary quiet. "Standard rotation cycle. Wake me if the field needs me again or in 40 years, whichever comes first." "Acknowledged, Captain," the tactical system replied, its voice carrying the same calm, unhurried patience it always had, the same patience that had waited 160 years for exactly the kind of tests that had finally arrived, and had answered. Both of them without ever once needing to raise its voice to prove the point. Imara Voss walked back through the sealed bulkhead door, past the plaque that read Terran's Sentinel Vessel Elegy, Vigil Class, commissioned in perpetuity. Do not disturb the watch, and paused there a moment longer than strictly necessary, running one gloved hand along the cool metal edge of the frame the way she imagined every captain before her had done at least once, in some private moment between one long sleep and the next. Then she settled into the cold, quiet dark of another stasis cycle, carrying with her the certainty that whatever the galaxy chose to believe about an old, ugly, overbuilt human ship drifting in a forgotten field of wreckage, the truth of it would still be waiting, patient, and unbothered, the next time someone foolish enough to test it eventually came looking. They had mocked the ancient human ship, calling it a relic too old and too worn to matter, exactly the reaction 160 years of deliberate, careful design had been built to invite. Its captain had walked out to answer that mockery exactly once, calmly and without cruelty, and had walked out again, months later, to answer a considerably more dangerous test with the same calm, the same restraint, and the same unwavering certainty that a promise kept quietly for a century and a half did not become any less binding simply because the rest of the galaxy had finally noticed it was real. The story that followed both encounters made certain nobody who heard it ever needed the lesson repeated a third time, and somewhere in the dark beyond Kess Hollow's drifting wreckage, an old ship that looked, to any passing stranger, like nothing more than another forgotten casualty of a war the galaxy had mostly stopped remembering, settled back into its long and patient watch, exactly as it had for 160 years, and exactly as it would, its captain fully intended. For as long as anyone still needed it to.